My brother announced his engagement on a Sunday afternoon, and my mother called me before he even had a chance to. "Aren't you happy?" she said. "Aren't you going to congratulate him?" I was sitting in my apartment in Austin, halfway through a bowl of cereal I'd been eating standing up over the sink. Because that's what you do when you're 31 and working 60 hours a week, and your personal life has basically been reduced to survival mode. I said, of course I was happy. I put down the bowl and sat on the couch and tried to sound like I meant it. His name is Conrad. 3 years younger than me, never met a room he didn't immediately own. Growing up, teachers remembered him. Coaches remembered him. My parents talked about him at dinner the way people talk about someone famous they happen to know personally. I wasn't jealous, not exactly. I just learned early that there was a specific kind of warmth in that house that wasn't really directed at me. The woman he was marrying was named Felicity. I'd met her twice at family dinners. She was fine. Perfectly pleasant. The kind of person who laughs at the right moments and asks follow-up questions and always seems to know what to order at a restaurant. I had no problem with Felicity. My problem was everything that came after that phone call. 2 weeks later, my mother called again. This time my dad was on the line too. "We need you to come home," my mother said. "The wedding is in 7 months. There's so much to do." I asked what kind of help they were thinking. "You're good at organizing things," my dad said. "You always have been." That was the closest thing to a compliment my father had given me in years, and I'd be lying if I said it didn't land. I was good at organizing things. I had spent the last 4 years building a project management career from the ground up, and I was genuinely good at it. I knew vendors and timelines and contracts and how to manage people who didn't want to be managed. I knew how to make something big happen without anyone noticing how much work it actually took. "What does Conrad think?" I asked. There was a small pause. "Conrad is busy," my mother said. "He's in the middle of a big case." Conrad was a financial advisor at a mid-sized firm in Nashville. A big case was not really terminology that applied to his job, but I didn't say that. I said I'd think about it. I should have stopped there. I should have thought about it for about 30 seconds and then called back and said no. But here's the thing about being the one in a family who's always been quietly competent. There's a part of you that's been waiting your whole life for them to finally notice. And that part is not always reasonable. I drove home to Nashville 3 weeks after that call. My parents lived in the same house I grew up in, a 4-bedroom colonial on a cul-de-sac in a suburb where everyone knew each other's cars. My mom had already turned the dining room table into a wedding command center. There were binders. Actual 3-ring binders with tab dividers. She'd done that part herself, I'll give her credit, but when I opened them, there was almost nothing inside. "We started," she said, a little defensively. "We just need someone to take it from here." The budget was $40,000. That was the number my parents had landed on, which is a real number for a Nashville wedding, on the lower end, but workable if you make smart choices. The venue hadn't been booked. The caterer hadn't been contacted. The florist, the DJ, the photographer, nothing. 7 months out with nothing locked in. "What does Felicity's family think about all this?" I asked. "They're contributing," my mother said, and changed the subject. I later found out contributing meant Felicity's parents had offered $5,000 toward the rehearsal dinner and left the rest to us. I say us because that's apparently what it had become. Conrad stopped by the house that first evening. He looked good, the way he always looked good. Like someone who gets enough sleep and has never once forgotten to moisturize. He hugged me and said it meant a lot that I was doing this. Not that he was glad I was there, not that he appreciated the drive, that it meant a lot that I was doing this, as if the task itself was already mine and he was just acknowledging the transfer of ownership. Felicity came too. She sat across from me at the kitchen table and flit a printed list across the surface like we were in a business meeting. She wanted peonies and garden roses and blush and ivory. She wanted a 4-piece string quartet for the ceremony and a DJ for the reception. She wanted a photo booth with custom props. She wanted a late-night snack station. She'd seen one at a friend's wedding, and it had been such a vibe. She wanted gold flatware. I looked at the list. I looked at the budget. "Some of these items are going to push us over," I said carefully. Felicity smiled. That's why we have you. I went home that night and sat in my old bedroom, which my mother had converted into a craft room sometime in the last decade. I slept on a pull-out cot next to a shelving unit full of scrapbooking supplies. I stared at the ceiling and told myself this was temporary. 7 months. I could manage a project for 7 months. What I didn't tell myself, because I wasn't ready to hear it, was that I had already started paying for things. It started small. I put a deposit on the venue because the date was about to be taken by another party and my mother didn't have her card on her. Just over $800. "We'll pay you back," she said. I said no problem. Then the forest required a signed contract and a deposit, and my mother asked if I could just handle it and sort out the money later. Another $1,200. Then Conrad decided the venue's in-house catering wasn't good enough, and he wanted an outside caterer, which meant a higher venue rental fee plus a separate catering contract. When I pointed this out, he looked at me like I'd said something mildly rude. "It's my wedding," he said. "I want it to be right." I nodded. I signed the new contract. By month 3, I had personally fronted just under $9,000 and been reimbursed for none of it. Every time I raised it, something came up. My mother had an unexpected car repair. My dad had a slow month at work. He'd been running a small HVAC business for 20 years, and it had good months and bad months, and this was apparently a bad one. Conrad was dealing with something at the firm. He'd pay me back after the wedding. It was just bad timing. I kept a spreadsheet. I kept every receipt. I told myself it would all get settled and I would be fine. Meanwhile, I was working on this wedding like it was my full-time job, which it had essentially become. I was in Nashville instead of Austin. I had negotiated a remote arrangement with my actual employer, but the time zones were difficult and the wedding logistics were consuming. I was coordinating with 11 different vendors. I was managing Felicity's ever-expanding wish list, which had grown to include a custom wedding arch, an ice sculpture for the cocktail hour, and a specific brand of sparkling water she'd read about on a blog. My mother was present for all of it in the way that someone can be physically present without contributing anything. She came to tastings, she nodded approvingly. She told her friends her daughter was handling the whole wedding and wasn't that wonderful. She told them Conrad was just so busy, bless his heart. I don't know exactly when I started to understand what was happening. It wasn't one moment. It was more like a slow, ugly sunrise, the kind that doesn't feel beautiful because you've been awake all night and you're exhausted, and the light just means the night is over. Not that anything is better. There was a dinner in month 4. A Sunday dinner, the kind my parents used to do when Conrad and I were in high school. Pot roast, rolls, sweet tea. Conrad came with Felicity. I came from the dining room where I'd spent most of the afternoon on the phone with the rental company about a linen situation. My dad said grace. My mother passed the rolls. Conrad talked about a client he'd landed, someone with a significant portfolio, and my parents leaned forward over their plates the way they always did when Conrad was talking. Then my mother mentioned, almost casually, that when Conrad and Felicity got settled after the honeymoon, she and my dad had been thinking it might make sense for Conrad to eventually take over the HVAC business. My dad was thinking about stepping back in a few years. Conrad had a good head for business. I put down my fork. "What about me?" I said. It came out quieter than I intended, almost like I was asking myself. My dad looked at his plate. My mother smiled, the careful smile she uses when she's about to say something she knows isn't quite right. "You have your career, sweetheart," she said. "You've built something in Austin. We wouldn't want to pull you away from that." "You already did pull me away from that," I said. "I've been here for 4 months." "That's different," Conrad said. "That was for the wedding." I looked at him. He was cutting his pot roast with the focused attention of someone who didn't want to be in this conversation. "I've been fronting money for this wedding," I said. "Almost $9,000 at this point. When are we talking about paying that back?" My mother set down her tea glass. "We said we'd handle it after the wedding," she said, and there was a slight shift in her voice. A cooling. "That's 3 months away," I said. "I need to understand when and how." My dad said something vague about cash flow. Conrad said something vague about cash flow. Conrad said something about the timing being complicated. Felicity looked at the centerpiece on the dining table like it had suddenly become very interesting, And then my mother looked at me with an expression I had seen before many times growing up, a kind of tired disappointment, like I was being difficult in a way that was both predictable and exhausting. "You know," she said, "the wedding is going to be a big day for this family. A happy day. It would really be a shame if anything put a cloud over it." She paused. "Conrad and Felicity have enough to worry about. This isn't the time to make things about money." I understood in that moment exactly what she was saying. Not the words, the message underneath. Don't make a scene. Don't ask for what you're owed. Smile and keep going because that's your role here. I excused myself to use the bathroom. I sat on the edge of the tub in my parents' bathroom, the one with the yellow tiles they'd never replaced, and I breathed very slowly and thought about what I was going to do. My friend Tess. We've been close since college. She's the kind of person who tells you what you need to hear even when you haven't asked. She had been saying for months that I needed to stop. She'd said it gently at first, then more directly. "They're not going to pay you back," she said once on a phone call in February. "Not because they can't. Because the whole setup only works if you keep going and never say the word invoice." I had pushed back on that. I said she didn't know my family, but sitting on the edge of that tub, I thought about what she said, and I thought about the spreadsheet on my laptop, and I thought about how I had given up 4 months of my life and nearly $9,000 for a wedding where my brother couldn't even be bothered to send a single vendor email himself. I went back to the dinner table. I finished my pot roast. I said very little. When I hugged my mother goodnight, she patted my arm the way she always did, and I got in my car and drove back to my parents' house and lay on that pull-out cot and did not sleep. Tess answered on the first ring when I called at 11:30. "Tell me what happened," she said. I told her. There was a long silence. "What do you want to do?" she asked. "I want to go home," I said. "To Austin." "Then go home," she said. "The wedding is in 3 months." "I know," she said. "Go home." I spent 2 days thinking about it. I made lists the way I do when I'm trying to think clearly. What would happen if I left? What was owed to vendors? What was legally my responsibility versus what I had taken on voluntarily? I'm careful and methodical. It's why I'm good at my job. I wasn't going to blow anything up carelessly. What I was going to do was withdraw. I was not a paid vendor. I was not under contract with anyone for the wedding. I had paid deposits and held reservations in my own name, which meant those deposits were mine and those reservations were mine to cancel or transfer. I had a spreadsheet showing every dollar I had put in. I called the venue and the florist and the catering company and the DJ and the photographer and the string quartet and the rental company. I told each of them that there had been a change in family circumstances and the event was being transitioned to the couple directly. I provided Conrad's contact information. I asked whether deposits could be transferred or were forfeited. Some could be transferred, some could not. The deposits I had put on my own card that could not be transferred, I requested refunds where possible and accepted the losses where not. All told, I recovered about $6,000 of the 9. The remaining $3,000 I wrote off as the cost of a very expensive lesson. Then I packed the 3 ring binders. I packed my laptop and my suitcase and the box of things I'd brought from Austin. I wrote a note, not a long one, and left it on the kitchen table. "Mom and Dad, I've transferred all vendor contacts and contracts to Conrad's email. The binders have everything organized by date. The wedding can absolutely still happen. It just needs to happen without me. I love you, but I need to go home. Leigh, I was on I-40 West by 7 in the morning. My phone started in around noon. My mother first, twice. Then my dad, which surprised me because he almost never calls. Then Conrad, 4 times in an hour. Then a number I didn't recognize which turned out to be Felicity. I didn't answer any of them. I pulled over once at a rest stop in Memphis and read the texts. My mother's were hurt and confused. My dad's were short and tired sounding. Conrad's started formal and got louder as they went. The last one read, "You have no idea what you've done." The florist said the deposit is non-refundable. The caterer needs a decision on the final menu by Friday. You can't just leave. This is our family. I sat with that for a minute. This is our family. I thought about all the Sunday dinners where he'd talked and I'd listened. I thought about the HVAC business conversation. I thought about the way my mother had looked at me across the pot roast and told me not to make things about money when I was literally owed money. I put the phone in my bag and got back on the highway. I was back in Austin by 9 that night. My apartment smelled stale, and a plant I'd forgotten to ask anyone to water had died in my absence, which felt about right. I stood in my kitchen for a long moment, just standing there, and for the first time in 4 months, I felt like I could breathe. I heard from my mother one more time about a week later. She called on a Tuesday evening and I answered because I had decided I wasn't going to spend my life avoiding phone calls. She told me the wedding had been postponed. Not canceled, postponed. Conrad and Felicity had managed to pull off a scaled-back version of the event. Something at a restaurant, a smaller guest list. No string quartet, no peonies. A sheet cake from a bakery instead of the custom 4-tier they'd had me book. My mother said it was fine in the tone of voice that means something was not fine. She told me Felicity's parents had stepped in with more money when the situation became clear. She didn't elaborate on what exactly they'd been told. She told me Conrad was upset. I said I understood. She said she hoped I knew how much hurt I had caused. I thought about responding to that carefully, the way I usually do, softening things, leaving room for reconciliation, protecting the peace at the cost of my own clarity. Instead, I said something I had been thinking for a long time. Mom, I said, I spent 4 months away from my actual life. I put in nearly $9,000. I managed every single vendor and decision for that wedding while Conrad sent me exactly 3 emails, and Felicity added items to the wish list. Not once in those 4 months did anyone ask how I was doing. Not once did anyone say thank you. At Sunday dinner, you told me not to make it about money. I think what you meant was, don't make it about me at all. I paused. I'm not angry at you. But I'm also not apologizing. There was a long silence. My mother said, I don't know where you got this idea that everything has to be so equal. I said, I got it from being treated like it didn't have to be. We didn't yell. We didn't say terrible things we couldn't take back. When we hung up, we both said, I love you because we do, in the complicated way that families do. But something had shifted. I could feel it even through the phone. I went to bed that night at 10, in my own bed, in my own apartment, with the window open and the sound of the street below. I had a call with my team the next morning and a project takeoff in the afternoon and a dinner with Tess on Friday, where I planned to order something expensive and eat all of it. I thought for a moment about Conrad and Felicity and a scaled-back restaurant wedding and a sheet cake. I didn't feel guilty. I had tried to feel guilty in those first few days after Memphis, and I kept coming up empty. Because here's what I knew, and had always known: I didn't ruin anything. There was nothing to ruin. What had been built was built on the assumption that I would keep going no matter how little I received in return. And when I stopped going, it turned out no one else had ever planned to pick it up. That's not my failure. That's the design. 3 months later, I got a promotion and a raise that more than covered what I'd lost. I celebrated alone with a glass of wine on my balcony, watching the sun go down over the city, and I thought about that pull-out cot and the 3-ring binders and the Sunday dinner with the pot roast and the careful, cooling look on my mother's face. I thought about how long I had been making myself small and useful and quiet so that I could be loved by people who had already decided how much love I was worth. And then I finished my wine and went back inside and I started the next chapter of my life, which, it turned out, had been waiting for me the whole time. I think about cause and effect a lot now. Not in any grand philosophical way, just the quiet, practical kind. The kind you learn when you've watched your own life play out like a series of decisions, each one pulling the next one forward whether you meant it to or not. For years, I made myself easy. I showed up. I absorbed the extra work and the unreturned favors and the dinners where my name came up mostly when something needed doing. I told myself that's what family means. That love sometimes looks like inconvenience, like sacrifice, like letting things slide. And maybe that's partly true. But there's a version of that story that stops being love and starts being a system. One where one person keeps giving and the other people keep receiving, and nobody ever has to say out loud that this is the arrangement. Because saying it out loud would make it too uncomfortable to continue. That's what I was living in. Not cruelty exactly. More like a quiet agreement that I had never actually signed. What I've come to understand is that the way people treat you over time is information. It's not always intentional. It's not always intentional. It's not always conscious. But it is consistent. Conrad didn't sit down one day and decide to take advantage of me. My parents didn't draw up a plan. What they did was follow the path of least resistance, which happened to run directly through me, and they kept following it because I kept laying it down in front of them. Every time I absorbed a cost without complaint, I was teaching them that I would absorb the next one. Every time I didn't ask to be paid back, I was teaching them their repayment was optional. The system only worked because I kept running it. When I withdrew, when I packed the binders and drove away, I wasn't punishing anyone. I was just stopping the part I had agreed to play without agreeing. And what happened next wasn't something I did to them. It was the natural consequence of a structure that had never actually been sound. The wedding didn't fall apart because I left. It fell apart because it had been built entirely on the assumption that I wouldn't. There's something in that worth sitting with, not as a cautionary tale about other people's behavior, but as a question about your own. Where in your life have you built yourself into a system that only runs because you never stop showing up? Where have you confused loyalty with availability? Where have you let I love you become a reason to accept being invisible? I'm not saying walk away from everyone who's ever asked too much of you. That's not the lesson. The lesson, if there even is one clean lesson, is that the most honest thing you can do for yourself and for the people around you is to be clear about what you will and won't carry. Not out of anger, not to prove a point. Just because the alternative is slowly disappearing into someone else's story while your own goes untold. I got home to Austin with a dead plant and an empty apartment and more clarity than I'd had in years. I had lost some money and some months and maybe some version of my family that I'd been quietly hoping for. But I had found something that felt more solid than any of that. The knowledge that I could stop and survive it and be okay. That turns out to be worth quite a lot.